Boy, do we get a lot of questions, Dr. Craig, and I'm glad they're asking you rather than me. Some of these are just really good. And there's so much, if you don't understand some of the terminology here, you can cross-reference it with other material from Reasonable Faith, your published work, and audio and video. So I want to encourage everyone to please do that. This one says, hello, Dr. Craig. I have a question about quantum superposition. We better stop right there.
That's right. What he's talking about would be states of affairs that are not determinate. They are neither one way nor another. A particle is not here or there. It's in an indeterminate state.
Okay. Many of my fellow students are atheists, and I've been trying to convince them that God exists. One of them, however, is intent on proving me wrong. He brought up this argument after our chemistry teacher did a lesson on quantum mechanics. The argument is as follows. Premise 1, a transcendent agency is all-seeing. Premise 2, observation collapses quantum superposition.
Now, maybe we should comment on premise 2. This is the so-called measurement problem in the traditional Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. And the idea is that these quantum states, as I just said, are in an indeterminate state. They're in a superposition, as it's said, where it's neither one nor the other. It's indeterminate. This idea is illustrated by the famous Schrödinger's cat, which is a cat that is locked inside of a box that is filled with a vial of poison gas that will kill the cat. And whether the vial is broken depends upon the indeterminate decay of a radioactive isotope. And so the question is the cat dead or alive? And according to quantum physics, the Copenhagen interpretation, that question has no determinate answer. The cat is neither dead nor alive. It's in this superposition of states because it's indeterminate whether the radioactive isotope has decayed and broken the vial. So what determines whether or not the cat is dead or alive? Well, the Copenhagen interpretation says whether you make an observation, whether you open the box and look at the cat, that will collapse this indeterminacy to make the cat either dead or alive. Now, Schrödinger took this as a reductio ad absurdum argument against the Copenhagen interpretation. A cat is not dead or alive dependent upon my observation of it. That would make reality dependent upon me and my observations. But many adherents to the Copenhagen interpretation, like apparently this student, believes in it. They think that reality is really indeterminate until there is some observation that collapses the indeterminacy and makes the state determinate. This is the so-called measurement problem in quantum physics.
That's been in popular science for a long time. Science readers, students tend to repeat it. It's something along the lines of the very act of observing this changes it.
Yes.
And I'm going, oh, that's hard to get your mind around, but that's
yeah, and a good many philosophers of science and physicists are very skeptical of the Copenhagen interpretation as a result. And you notice in my debate with Sean Carroll a year or so ago, he said, well, this at least is one thing on which Craig and I can agree, that the Copenhagen interpretation is nonsense.
Okay.
But here, this argument is presupposing it. So let's let him have his go.
Okay. A transcendent agency is all-seeing. And premise 2, observation collapses quantum superposition. Premise 3, we observe that quantum superpositions of particles are not collapsed. See, therefore, an all-seeing entity cannot exist. How would I go about refuting this argument?
Well, I would say that premise 3 is self-contradictory. We observe that quantum superpositions of particles are not collapsed. You cannot observe that, because the minute you do observe it, you collapse it. You collapse the situation. So it's incoherent to say that we observe that quantum superpositions of particles are not collapse. That's something you cannot observe. You can't look into Schrodinger's box without collapsing the indeterminacy and making it one way or another. Now, what's interesting, and I think uncomfortable for the person pressing this objection, is that I think this actually implies the existence of God, if you adopt this interpretation. Because you see, the finite observer looking into the box can himself be given a quantum physical description. As a physical object, he can be described by quantum physics. That means he exists in an indeterminate superposition of states unless somebody else observes him. But then the same thing is true of that person, and you get a chain where nobody is collapsed. There is no reality, and yet classical reality obviously exists. I mean, here we are. So what collapses the ultimate indeterminacy of the whole universe? Ultimately, it leads to a kind of ultimate observer who collapses the indeterminacy in the universe, and therefore is implied by the Copenhagen interpretation. Otherwise, it would never get collapsed and nothing would ever truly exist. So this Copenhagen interpretation, I think, ultimately implies the existence of such a being, which is necessary to collapse the indeterminacy of the universe and halt the infinite regress of measurers. That's the answer to the measurement problem, is you halt it with a non-physical observer. And because the observer is non-physical, you see, he cannot be described by the equations of quantum mechanics, and therefore that's why the chain of observation stops with the ultimate observer who transcends the physical world and collapses the indeterminacy in the universe. So this is actually, I think, a good argument for the existence of God if you embrace this Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics.
Yeah, and saying that God is all-seeing doesn't mean that he looks and sees.
No, we can say all-knowing instead of, I mean, it's not literally all-seeing.
Okay, another question. Dr. Craig, thank you for your work as a Christian philosopher and your truly authentic example you set for those pursuing, such as myself, degrees in particular areas and seeing it as a service unto Christ. I am noticing an important trend among persons who I have shared the material with, even if only a little of the material, apathy. There exists simply an apathetic attitude to the fundamental insight into the human condition. My concern is that those who understood the implications of God's non-existence very clearly, like Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Pascal, etc., will not have their message received effectively. What do you think about this apathetic approach to God's existence and possible ways in which the core insights of perhaps Pascal can be displayed to an apathetic person? As a side question, are you coming to Canada anytime soon? So apathy among someone.
Well, in answer to the last question, I don't have any Canadian trips planned, but I think this is a huge problem. And in fact, there's even a name that's been given to this. Apatheism is the label. It's not someone who denies the existence of God. It's somebody who just doesn't care. And so he's an apatheist. What can you do to shake the apathetic person out of his lethargy and get him to think about these things? Well, that was precisely the problem that Pascal faced when he wrote his apology for the truth of the Christian faith, was how to reach the libertine French people of his day who just didn't care. And my best shot at doing this is my work on the absurdity of life without God, where I adopt a kind of Pascalian approach and try to get the apathetic person to see that if God does not exist, that his life is ultimately absurd that his life is meaningless, valueless, and purposeless, and that it is impossible to live consistently within that kind of a framework, and therefore he needs to think about whether God exists. And I think this is a powerful tool if you can share these arguments with someone, particularly the question of moral values and duties. Every day we get up, we answer by how we treat other people whether we think objective moral values and duties really exist or whether everything is relative. And so this is the kind of question that is really inescapable for human beings. And that's my best shot. There are people who are so apathetic, they don't even care about this if you show them their life is meaningless and valueless and purposeless. And for that kind of person, all I can recommend is prayer. God may need to shake him with some deep tragedy in his life, or I find that growing up, getting married and having children and being faced with a question of what values are you going to teach your children can shake people out of their apathy and make them begin to think again. But my best shot is to try to explain to a person the absurdity of life without God. That doesn't show that God exists, but with Pascal, it shows that this is a question of enormous consequence and one that we can't be apathetic about.
And it could do the shaking necessary of that apathy.
Yeah.
Here's a question about the Gospels. Dr. Craig on page 13. Hello, Dr. Craig. I read On Guard several years ago and have to say that it has absolutely changed my life. Thank you so much for your work in making solid Christian apologetics accessible. I have an ongoing discussion on the existence of God and the Christian worldview with a close agnostic friend for a year or so now. I always make a point to allow him to initiate or restart the conversation, which he frequently does. Our debate is respectful, friendly, and appears to be having a profound effect on him. He recently conceded that it is possible that a timeless, spaceless, and material personal creator did create the universe, although he is reluctant to call this creator God. Since conceding the possibility of a creator of the universe, our conversation has moved on to Christianity. He is stuck on what he perceives to be the unreliable nature of the orally transmitted New Testament documents. I've shared some of your articles on the reliability of the gospel documents, but he is very stuck on the oral transmission part. Can you address the oral gospel traditions and explain how or why they are trustworthy?
He doesn't explain the reason for his friend's skepticism about the oral transmission of the gospel traditions. I suspect it's because he's thinking of it in comparison with the child's game of telephone, where one child whispers something in the ear of another, and then they pass on the message, and the fun of the game is that by the time you get to the end, it's so totally garbled that it's utterly unlike what was initially said. And that is an anachronistic and inappropriate model to use for understanding the Jewish transmission of traditions, particularly sacred traditions. In an oral culture, the ability to memorize and to pass on accurately and faithfully large tracts of tradition is a highly developed and highly prized skill, one that we in a literary culture have largely lost, quite honestly.
Oh yeah, I even heard how it's difficult to, it's becoming more difficult to remember telephone numbers because we have them assigned to one button or, to a name.
Isn't that interesting?
And, yeah, so that's an illustration.
And
of
it's
how you
inconceivable to us that people at that time could have had whole books memorized.
Yes. Oh yeah.
Speeches memorized, because in an oral culture, this skill is highly developed, and particularly in a Jewish world, in the synagogue, in the home, and in schools, children were trained on the skill of memorizing and transmitting faithfully large blocks of oral tradition. Moreover, when you get to the Gospels, the phase of oral transmission is so early that it's still in contact with the eyewitnesses. And so some people have said, this is not really oral tradition, this is oral history, because the eyewitnesses are still around to correct someone who might depart from an accurate transmission of the traditions about Jesus. So when you're able to drive back behind the Gospels and behind the letters of Paul to this oral phase, rather than the diminishing the historical credibility of what you're reading, it actually increases it, because it's driving it back so early that legend and inaccuracy will not have had adequate time, frankly, to develop and to destroy the testimony of the eyewitnesses and the living memory of those who accompanied and knew Jesus. And I think when you look at the Gospels, you can tell that they do faithfully recount the traditions about Jesus, because you can compare them with one another to see how these sources are transmitted. One of the most important features of gospel criticism today is to identify within the Gospels independent traditions narrating the same event. And when you do this, you will find that there are differences in the way the story is told, but typically the core of the story and the point of the story will be accurately transmitted. So, for example, compare Mark's account of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem with John's account of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. These are independent traditions, and yet they coincide in the essentials, even though there may be differences in the way the oral tradition is transmitted. Mm-hmm. As I say, in our culture, we don't have something really parallel to this. About the closest that would come to it would be the telling of a joke, where as different people tell the same joke, they may vary the details a little bit here and there, but typically the punchline will be memorized accurately and will be the same. Mm-hmm. And I actually experienced this, Kevin, some time ago. I remember when I was in seminary, my professor related a story, or a joke rather, to us. He said, what did the Calvinist say when he fell down the elevator shaft? And the answer was, well, he got up, dusted himself off, and said, am I glad that's over? Well, it was a great joke about predestination and so mm-hmm. forth. But 20 years later, I heard someone else say to me, what did the Calvinist say when he fell down the stairs? And I immediately recognized, mm-hmm. oh, this is a different version of the same joke. And I said, what? And he said, he got up, dusted off his clothes, and said, whew, am I glad that's over? Mm-hmm. It was the same punchline within a story that varied the details a little bit, you know? And this is what you find in the Gospels. You find freedom to tell the story in different ways with regard to the secondary details, but the core of the story will be the same. And so I think we have very good grounds for thinking that the gospel traditions have been faithfully transmitted, and especially when you have multiple independent attestation of the same event, then you can be sure that you're on historical bedrock. And as I show in the book On Guard, which this reader is familiar with, the gospel traditions with respect to things like the burial and the discovery of the empty tomb of Jesus are multiply and independently attested in such a way that we have real confidence that we are getting here the historical core of the story accurately related.
Okay. A science question, Dr. Craig, actually about science. Dr. Craig, first I want to thank you and Jan for all that you do. I first watched Dr. Craig debate Anthony Flew and became captivated by the idea of apologetics. Pausing there, boy, that was a long time ago, wasn't it? That was,
Yes.
Yeah. Later, a few years, I went through a really hard season, and as much as I wanted to question the reality of God, I just could not get past the arguments and evidence Dr. Craig had been teaching in his debates and podcasts. Thank you so very much for your work.
I can't tell you, Kevin, how great that makes me feel, that these arguments and evidence served as a firewall for him.
Yes.
When he went through a hard time, we don't know what it was, perhaps a time when an untutored person might have walked away from the faith.
Yeah, because hard times have a tendency to blow away the more trivial or the weaker things, or the cliches and platitudes that we hold on to.
You've experienced this recently yourself.
Yes.
With the death of your son.
Yes, I have.
And I wondered, how would the problem of evil and suffering affect Kevin, having experienced it now so intensely and personally? It's no longer just an intellectual issue.
That's right.
Would it cause him to question his faith and doubt? But when I asked you this, you told me that it really didn't.
No, and it's because of the bedrock of a big rock, the one that is moved away from the stone, from the tomb, the empty tomb, the resurrection of Jesus. And I landed crashing through every platitude and cliche I've ever heard, and landed right there. And so this is very important, and this is why we do what we do, Bill.
Yeah.
He continues, when debating my atheist coworker, after presenting your arguments and refuting his arguments, he will always say, well, we just don't know for sure. What do I say when he says, we will just have to wait till science figures it out?
I think that there's a couple of points to make here. One is to say, or point out to him, that his arguments are not all arguments to which science is even relevant. When you think about arguments like Leibniz's argument from contingency, this is a philosophical or metaphysical argument to which the data of science has no relevance. There's nothing there for science to figure out if you understand the argument. Similarly, the moral argument is an argument to which science is irrelevant. It's an argument about the foundations of ethics. And science is neutral with respect to ethics. It doesn't speak to the moral realm. The ontological argument for God's existence is, again, a metaphysical argument that has nothing to do with science. So one of the strengths of the God hypothesis is that it explains a wide range of the data of human experience. Scientific, philosophical, ethical, historical, they're not all just one type of argument. And so this easy dismissal, we'll wait till science figures it out, just doesn't cut mustard with respect to some of these arguments, because they are not arguments to which science is relevant. Now, with respect to the arguments to which science is relevant, particularly the Kalam cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument for a cosmic creator and designer, there I think what you should say is, well, why are you unwilling to follow the evidence of science where it leads? Because that's what the person is really doing. You're not punting to God to plug up a gap in scientific knowledge. You're not appealing to a God of the gaps. You're saying that the best scientific evidence that we have today, however tentative and provisional it may be, points to the fact that the universe began to exist. That's the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument. Why are you reluctant to follow the evidence where it points? Why won't you follow the evidence that science gives you? The best evidence of contemporary science says the fine-tuning of the universe cannot be explained by physical necessity or by chance. So why are you reluctant to follow the evidence of science to where it leads? It's not the theist here who is failing to follow the scientific evidence where it points. It's the non-theist who, for some reason, is backing away from the evidence of contemporary science and refusing to follow the evidence where it leads. And that, I would say, is just begging the question against theism. He sees probably where it's leading, and therefore he pulls back. But that's unjustified, I think. You should follow the best evidence of science where it leads.
And when his friend says, well, we just don't know for sure, that's just another way of saying we don't have certainty. I need 100% certainty, and we don't have that, so you don't have a case.
Well, in that case, I think there are 2 points to make. One is that you shouldn't be seeking for certainty. We're looking for what's probably the case. Certainty is a will-o'-the-wisp. Very few things that we're certain about, and it's not the criterion for knowledge. But secondly, science doesn't prove things for sure. Scientists themselves emphasize this over and over again, that science doesn't prove things for sure. What science does is it provides models for explaining things, and you assess these models in terms of their explanatory power, their explanatory scope, their simplicity, their ad hocness or not, and then you determine, well, which are the best explanations for this data. And that's what you should be looking for, not certainty.
The questioner says, and lastly, when do I know to no longer debate with him? It seems apparent to me that he isn't sincerely seeking, but is more hurt by the church than anything. Do I stop objecting to his YouTube atheist question of the week? It seems that he doesn't care to know the truth, just what other atheists says. What do I say to him? And when do I stop humoring him?
I say as long as he's taking the initiative and bringing his question of the week, you keep giving good responses to it. And I'll tell you, I've seen this in the lives of other unbelievers. You have no idea of the inner conflict that may be going on in this person's life behind the bravado that may eventually crack, and he may come to faith in God and in Christ. So as long as he is taking the initiative, you keep sharing with him. And if you do get to know him well and have his confidence, then I think the listener can begin to raise these deeper questions. I sense some anger behind that question. Have you been hurt by people in the church? Have religious people in some way hurt you that has made you hostile? What's the source of this hostility that I'm sensing in you, if you don't mind my asking? And probe gently. And you may then begin to excavate deeper issues of a pastoral nature that may get at the real grounds for his resistance to the gospel.